Okay, looks like we might be live now. I'll give you a couple of minutes to join the room. I'm just gonna load it up myself now as well, just to make sure that it's coming through as it should be. It looks like it is. Cool. All right, let's do this. Hello, everyone. I'm gonna try if I can and tune into the chat. And so, if you do have any questions, I will try and get to them. But my screen also gets taken up by this presentation, as you'll see, and so I'm flying a little bit blind. But do put questions if you do have them in the chat, and I'll do my very best to get to them towards the end. So I'm Kane Simms. I'm one of the co-founders of VUX World. We're a conversational automation consultancy, and we help organizations understand what conversational AI is capable of and how they implement it into their transformation programs and into some of their automation initiatives. And with this talk today, I wanted to try and help raise the importance of conversational automation within your mind and within your organization. Because I think that within the community, within the conversation design community, within the voice community, we're all really passionate about these interfaces because they're cool, because they're natural, because they're exciting. But in the early days, if any of you ever tried to sell an Alexa skill to an organization, the question always becomes about value. And so, what I want to do today is I want to demonstrate why there is a need to pursue conversational automation as part of your digital transformation strategy. I'm going to use a few common examples that you might be familiar with, and a couple of frameworks as well to start really trying to visualize this in your mind and the importance of it. And then towards the end, we're going to start looking at maturity cycles and try and help you identify what stage of maturity you might be in from a conversational automation perspective, and some of the kind of the visioning things that you can think about, and some of the kind of like roadmap items that you might be able to identify and prioritize in future. And so without that, let's kind of get into it. If you are interested in conversational AI in general, then I definitely recommend you check out our podcast, VUX World. Every week we do live shows on LinkedIn and YouTube, and we have industry experts and practitioners along to share how they do what they do so that you can do what you do better. So why digital transformation? Then why is conversational AI a core part of digital transformation, and what is driving it? What's driving the need for it over and above it's natural and it's nice? So I like to use this strategic drift framework, and for those of you who've done either marketing or you work on the strategy side of businesses and things like that and brands, you might be familiar with this framework. And I've used this many times in the past, working with many organizations and kicking off and running through their transformation programs, because it really helps crystallize where your organization is. It really helps you understand where you are in the context of the wider environment and the kind of trends that are happening in the marketplace. And so this graph here, if you look at the left-hand side, that represents the amount of change, and that change can be in any area that you want. The change might be high-speed broadband availability. The change might be wide adoption of mobile computing. The change might be decrease in chip sizes with higher processing power. It might be, there's a whole range of things that can change in the marketplace and in the environment. And as things change, typically what businesses do most of the time is you're a little bit behind that change. And so this first sort of step, this first phase is iterative kind of approaches to try and keep up with changing demand. I'm going to give you some examples to try and crystallize this as well. But for now, let's just go with things change, businesses change in response to it. Okay. And then what happens is you realize that you can't keep on changing in that kind of way because things move too fast. You know, if anyone's even remotely interested in conversational AI and speech technology, you will be well aware of how fast this industry moves, and the pace of change from a technology perspective is staggering. And so most organizations can't keep up, and they end up in this phase, which is called strategic drift. It means that the business is failing to keep pace with the rest of the market in whatever respect is changing. And then you end up in this phase here, which is flux. And the flux is where you're kind of scrambling around, trying different things. You don't really have a strategy, but you know you need to do something, and you're just trying things, and it's really challenging. The amount of wasted money on IT, on technology, the amount of failed projects, the amount of failed transformation initiatives and organizational change initiatives is staggering. And you'll see every other week there's a company that's in trouble, and it's because of this flux phase. They don't really know what their strategy is, don't really know what their vision is, and they're just flapping around trying to tread water. And then what happens is the market's moved on, things have changed, things have moved on, and now you're left with this big chasm, which is how you operate and where you are and where the rest of the market is. And that is what is known as transformation. Bridging that gap is what is known as digital transformation. Organizations that have a largely analog legacy infrastructure and a business model that hasn't changed for a long time, and a culture that hasn't adapted for a long time, either needing to transform the way they operate, the way the business works, the way the culture works, the staff base and skill sets that they have, the way that they do business needs to change to realign themselves with where the market is and where the market's going. And there's been countless examples of organizations that haven't managed to do this. An organization that keeps pace, that keeps pushing that innovation curve is Apple, as you'll all know. And Apple and Google and Samsung and many other companies like that who manage to squeeze processors into these tiny little mobile devices and squeeze cameras in there as well, are responsible in part for your likes of the struggles that we've seen with Kodak. Okay, so Kodak used to develop films in cameras. Every smartphone now has a camera, which has pretty much obliterated the need for point and shoot cameras. All right, they're not needed anymore because things have moved on and organizations have pushed that change. Netflix and Blockbuster is another prime example. If you go right the way down to the left hand side of this curve here, where it started was Netflix started posting out DVDs instead of making people go to a shop like Blockbusters were doing. And then high-speed broadband came along and Netflix started streaming films. You could post the films back whenever you wanted to, no late fees, all that kind of stuff. But Blockbuster still had this store footprint and this culture of you have to come to us, you have to rent the DVD, you have to come back and post it. And then what ended up happening is Netflix, with started commissioning their own films, started being available on multiple devices. And Blockbuster just didn't change what they were doing. They thought that they could make money off selling more popcorn when you got to the till. They didn't realize that the entire industry had shifted. And so they ended up in trouble. Google is a prime example with Android, and again, Apple you could bring into that as well, and Samsung as well. And Nokia is always the story that people use when we talk about the mobile age. Nokia failed to see that full touch screens and mobile computing was going to be the thing, and they ended up getting in a bit of trouble because of Android and Apple. Facebook and MySpace, another story that didn't end well for MySpace. MySpace was built on legacy infrastructure. They hadn't invested in their architecture, and they failed to respond to the things that Facebook were doing, which was connecting real people who people who live down the street, and providing a platform for everybody to communicate and catch up. Amazon on the retail side is obviously a no-brainer. Every high street in the country, in the UK, and I'm assuming that the US is pretty much the same as well, are in real trouble because the organizations that were brick and mortar first failed to respond to the growing trend of online shopping, and Amazon were doing that incredibly well. So Woolworths went out of business. Debenhams have just been bought by Boho. Arcadia Group are in real trouble now. And it's not because necessarily, it is because people are not going to the high street, but it's also because these organizations didn't act quickly enough to transform themselves and reorient themselves to position themselves strongly in a digital world. And so that's what we're kind of getting at when we talk about transformation. And the real thing that's changed when we talk about what's changed, all of these examples that I've been talking about all fall under the bracket of customer expectations. That's the real thing that has dramatically changed over the 10 years, is the expectations that we have, that consumers have, when it comes to accessing services, getting things done, and accessing your products and services. I'm going to give you some examples of some of the areas within that customer expectations that have changed and been impacted. One is end-to-end self-service, right? We expect to get done whatever we need to get done ourselves. We don't expect a helping hand from you. Don't expect to call your contact center. We don't expect any of that. When was the last time you had to call Google? There'll be some people who have had to call Google. I had to call Google myself when I was migrating from 365 over to G Suite. So on occasion you will have to, but it's very rare. Comparatively speaking, if you put all of the Google users into a big bucket and then profiled how many of them had to go and contact Google about something, it's a very small percentage. Same with Netflix, very similar to with Facebook, and very similar to Amazon, because they've oriented their business so that you can do absolutely everything on your own. That's the whole point. Digital end-to-end self-service. So how did organizations respond to that self-service, digital-first phase? Well, they put stuff online, didn't they? They started putting things online self-service. But what they didn't do is they didn't look at the infrastructure that sits behind the online. They didn't look at the infrastructure that underpins their business. And so they end up with online forms that don't integrate with their line of business systems. They end up with things that cause themselves more work than they do anything else, just so that they can have a front end that seems as though it's self-service. 24/7 access. cause people huge problems. Netflix doesn't turn off. Google doesn't turn off. Facebook doesn't close. It's 24/7 access. Now, that sounds really obvious. Of course, everything's 24/7 access these days. But for the vast majority of organizations, that's just not how they roll. For retailers, that's not always how they roll. When Topshop closes, it closes. Yes, you can go online, but we've already mentioned the failure to invest heavily online, and then they lose market share to digital native companies like ASOS and whatnot. And so the 24/7 access ended up turning into organizations thinking, right, well, we need to stay open. We need to open longer. We need to have our call centers open longer. We need to recruit more staff so that we can stay open longer. Rather than investing in the technology that will allow their business to automate itself, they invested in all of that existing analog infrastructure just to try and squeeze out more mileage from the current operating model, which is an operating model that needs some attention, as we'll see. And then, they'll outsource things to BPOs. The contact center closes at 5. So what happens? Well, we send it all to the Philippines, just so that we can have this facade of being open 24/7. And all that stuff that happens during the closing hours to opening hours ends up on someone's desk when they turn into work the next day. And so it's stacking up work because they're not operating on a 24-hour basis. They're just sticking a stick and plaster over it. Channel of choice. If I want to watch Netflix on my mobile, I'll watch it on my mobile. If I want to watch it on a TV, I'll watch it on my TV. And I expect the same level of service across all of those channels. Exactly the same with Google. You don't expect the Google mobile website to function differently to the desktop website. You expect everything to be totally seamless. And that sounds obvious as well. It sounds straightforward. It sounds, obvious. But the reality is, organizations have struggled to do that. They've struggled to have a fully joined up multi-channel or omni-channel strategy. They just, again, stick and plasters over things. They invest in live chat. When what ends up happening is you invest in live chat, you end up having to put resources into it. And so your staff are now overworked because they've got more stuff coming in through the website. Or they invest in a basic chatbot that they say doesn't really work because they haven't really thought about it strategically. They've just tried to stick and plaster over it. They rush to the cloud because everything's on-prem and, COVID happens. Everyone has to work from home. They don't have the infrastructure to allow you to work from home. So everything gets, knee-jerk decisions to get you into the cloud, or they'll invest in something like an Alexa skill, and then wonder why it hasn't worked out for them. And again, the big thing here is what all of these companies have done. The big thing that's changed is actually delightful customer experience. When you've searched on Google, what Google have done over the years is they've trained you on what a good search looks like and how a good search works. So when you search for something on Google, you expect a result. That mental model translates onto every other website or app or every other business that you engage with. You search for something, you expect a result. Same thing from Amazon. That one-click purchase thing and same-day delivery completely changes what you expect of other retailers. And so they're reframing what it's like to engage with a business. And the big thing that's changing right now is that all of these companies, you can put Samsung in there, you can put Microsoft in there, you can put Facebook in there. They're all investing in conversational AI. And what they're now doing is they're setting a new standard about what it's like to engage with your organization and with organizations in general. The first point of contact for these organizations in the next 10 years will be their AI assistant. And I think that the first point of contact for most organizations that get this and think about this from a transformation perspective will have their first point of contact across all of their channels being an AI agent as well. But it's not just the front end. It's not just having a conversation on the front end. It's being able to actually deliver on what it is that customers need to get done, which is where this concept of conversational automation comes in. And so how do you organize your business, reorient your business, rethink about the way that you operate and the services that you provide and how you provide them in a conversational automation lens? And so there's a number of ways to think about it. We think about it on this maturity scale. And if you can identify where you are on this maturity scale, you'll be able to figure out the best next steps for you, essentially. So there might be people out there right now listening to this who are in the incubation phase. They're thinking about it. They haven't done anything yet. And they're wondering, what the impact is going to be and where they're going to be able to find value. You then move into this crawl phase as the first thing you'll implement might be something that's trying to prove the value. It's a proof of concept or a minimum viable product that you launch that will try and seek to prove the value of having a conversational interface or a conversational assistant. And you can start with that really, really small. If you look at the Microsoft services, the Azure AI services, you can start out so small. You don't have to boil the ocean. You could start out with something simple in your contact center, a virtual assistant, and all it does is it handles routine customer support queries, things that don't require any integration into your line of business systems, just routine queries. Comwave, a large telco in Canada, managed to automate 1% of their incoming calls with customer queries, and that 1% automation paid for their entire investment in conversational AI because they're dealing with millions and millions of calls every month. And so this stuff can pay for itself just looking for the high volume, really simple use cases. And then what happens is you start to learn, you start to grow, you start to understand where the value is, you start to understand how you can scale it, and you start walking, you start picking up the pace a little bit. You look at more advanced use cases, and you start to think about how can you integrate that into your line of business systems to start facilitating some of this end-to-end transactions. Maybe you introduce another channel. You've worked out your conversational patterns for these use cases, and you can squeeze it into another environment. Maybe you've got APIs into some of your line of business systems, which enable you to do some self-service. You can expand on your use cases. And then once you're in that position, you can then start to think about standardizing this approach with a center of excellence. You invest in the team, you invest in the capabilities, you create principles, you've got a vision, you've got a roadmap, you've got your standards that you work towards, and the organization's bought in. And this is when it starts becoming part of the organizational strategy. It starts out in an incubation innovation phase, and then it starts moving towards adding real measurable business value. And in that phase, maybe you start exploring emerging channels like assistants. Maybe you start putting things in there that assist agents, not just call center agents, but agents that work in all roles across your organization. You give them the tools that will allow them to anticipate customer needs and serve people more effectively and streamline some of their repetitive tasks. Then you can extend your use cases, you can extend your integrations into your line of business systems. And then you'll reach a point, and I don't think many in fact, I've never come across one company that's at this stage yet. You'll reach a point where you're able to start devolving, right? And this maturity scale is a version of a typical digital transformation maturity scale, and I've just applied it to conversational AI, and it works exactly the same way. You're going to reach a point where you're going to have trouble scaling, right? Large organizations, multiple services, multiple divisions, hundreds or thousands of staff. You're going to hit with a center of excellence. You'll hit a crunch point when it comes to scaling, and so you need to start democratizing the tools, democratizing the processes, democratizing your standards, and having empowered, skilled factories all across the organization that work together horizontally that will allow you to start scaling this, and that will allow you to get into more channels because you'll find more channels, you'll discover emerging use cases, you'll also discover other systems and line of business systems that exist, and you might need to use robotic process automation where you don't have API availability. And what you'll find as you start increasing use cases, increasing channels, increasing capability, you'll find that you have this brain now that essentially is it understands the organization. It understands all your transactions. It understands all of your queries. It understands all of your staff's problems and processes. It understands everything that you do. And your whole business can now be oriented around that. It will cause you to question some of these line of business systems. It'll start you to think about, do we have some duplicate capability here that we don't really need? Are we set up in the most effective way? Are we being inefficient in any way, shape, or form? And you'll start to go through that process. And this is why it needs to be aligned with the transformation strategy, because on the transformation side, there may well be teams and people who are already looking at this stuff. They're already looking at your infrastructure. They're already looking at your technical capability and your culture and how you serve people and what your operating model is. And this stuff needs to feed into that, because as I said, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, this virtual assistant may well be the first touch point for most people when it comes to dealing with your organization. And the next stage, the final stage after that, is total fitness, it's total capability. You've got an AI first culture, you've got capabilities and skills within all teams, and you think AI first. In the same way as we used to think digital first, you think AI first. And again, I think that most organizations are probably 5 to 10 years away from even thinking about that right now. Most are in this run, or not most actually, most are in the crawl or walk phase. Some like Bank of America, US Bank, BBC, they're in this center of excellence phase where they've got standards, they're really starting to crack it. But I'm not seeing very many in those latter two phases. So most of the work that we do with VUX World focuses on getting you out of the incubation phase into the crawl phase, or helping you go from the crawl phase to the walk and the run phase. And if any of that is remotely interesting for you, if you think that it's of value and you want to learn a little bit more, if you want a free 20-minute strategy call, you can go to vux.world and book in a free session there. No obligation, obviously. We're genuinely here to help. And we do have a free workshop running next Wednesday in partnership with Cognigy, where we're going to start running you through how to assess where you are on that maturity scale, how to think about your short, medium, and long-term goals, how to identify and prioritize use cases to get you started, how to identify the team and skill sets that you already have that you can galvanize to start getting a move on with this thing, and then how to identify cultural and organizational opportunities and barriers that you need to go and address. And you will leave there with an action plan of how you can get started. And if that isn't of interest, then do follow us on all those social channels. As I said, we do live podcasts every Thursday. We do Clubhouse sessions if you're on Clubhouse. We do practical conversational AI sessions on there. Or you can drop me an email, Kane at vux.world. And so that is it. I did say I would try and get into some questions if there are any questions. Michael Novak has one. I know we're probably a bit short on time, but Michael Novak is saying experience and expectations soon to infiltrate businesses similar to cell phone adoption. Exactly. I think you might be talking about people bringing their outside habits into the workplace. I would imagine. I think that'll probably be the case. If you're used to talking to your devices and you're used to getting things done with your voice, then you will start to expect that in the workplace. I do know people who have taken their Alexa smart speakers into work before. I don't know if we're at that point yet, but definitely organizations will need to think about adding a voice front end or voice capability to their line of business systems going forward. We're doing some work with some software companies thinking about that right now. I think that'll probably take a little bit longer, to be honest, but you can soon get started with Microsoft Teams and things like that. You can build conversational workflows, end-to-end workflows within Microsoft Teams that can start that cultural movement, start people getting comfortable and used to having conversational interfaces being part of their job. And in the enterprise, the biggest opportunity for this is conversational search by far and away. If you look at what Algolia were doing and Lucy AI, making organizations files, repositories, information stored on SharePoint in files, making it accessible and easy to find through natural language is a huge, huge win. The amount of time people waste finding files, typing emails, and all that stuff is unbelievable. So definitely it will hit the enterprise, I think, in a big way very soon. So that's pretty much it. That's me out of time, 2 minutes over. I hope you did enjoy it. And yeah, by all means, if you are remotely interested in what we were talking about just then, the workshops and all that kind of stuff, then feel free to reach out, Kane at vux.world. Cheers.